The Fed has a tough path to walk in the months ahead when navigating timing on interest rates cuts. That balance made all the more difficult by the upcoming presidential election. At yesterday's news conference, Fed Chair Jay Powell insisted that politics will not affect the committee's decisions.
It's not something I'm focused on doing our jobs. This year is going to be a highly consequential year for the Fed and for monetary policy, and we're all of us very buckled down, focused on doing our jobs.
With more, we're joined by Nick Timiraos. He's chief economics correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. He was, of course, at that press conference yesterday. Nick, it's good to see you. So, I mean, they're humans, right? And so they're aware of what's going on in the world around them. And it's going to be tricky to not at least show the appearance that they're sort of favoring one candidate or the other, right?
Well, you're right in that the stakes are high here, but I think it's because the stakes are so high. If you're the Fed, you've got the economy right now almost right where you want it from the standpoint of inflation's looking a lot better than it was 6 months ago, but the economy hasn't slowed down nearly as much as you would have expected to get that disinflation. So if you're going for the soft landing, you've got a chance here. And I think that in some ways makes it easier to kind of tune out the politics because, at the end of the day, pulling off the soft landing is going to be more important and memorable than almost anything else here.
Nick, you make a good point in your piece I wanted to go over with you, which is you note that, listen, the Fed can always impact economic and therefore political outcomes. But your point in the piece there, Nick, was that perhaps the potential for that is heightened this year. What did you mean by that?
Well, the Fed's interest and the interest of the president are not always aligned, right? Because if the president is running for re-election, and I'm not talking about Biden per se, but any president running for re-election is going to want the economy to be as good as it possibly can be in the next few months. The Fed's interest is for there to be a good economy, but they're going to take a longer view. And so I think that's the challenge here for the Fed is how do they tune out some of the political noise? They're going to be under pressure. There's going to be pressure from Democrats when Jay Powell testifies, probably next month on Capitol Hill. Why are you holding rates so high if inflation's low? And there could be pressure if the Fed goes too soon, as seen by Republicans as going too soon and saying, well, wait a minute, what happened to your focus on inflation? I think, a key point here is that it's not like there's only risk on one side still. There's risk on both sides. There's risk that inflation stays too high or reaccelerates. There's risk that the economy slows down too soon. And so even if you were trying to be political about this, it's not clear exactly which way you go here. And I think that does help the Fed in some respects because they can just focus on trying to keep inflation down with a solidly growing economy.
We did speak to former Dallas Fed president yesterday, Robert Kaplan, about how the Fed, obviously he has experience. So we talked to him about how the Fed sort of thinks during an election year. And this is what he said.
So having been there during two elections now, 16 and 20, what you try to do is think what is the right thing to do for the economy? You screen out political considerations or political influence. I think the one thing you would do is as you approach the election, I think I'd be careful not to want to make unnecessary moves or abrupt moves.
And Nick, I wonder if that last part sort of implies that if the Fed acts, it will act with sort of a buffer timing-wise before the election, or might be more likely to do so.
I think Rob makes a good point. I talked to some other former Fed presidents who made the point that politics won't influence what the Fed does. It won't influence the timing or the strategy, but it could influence, the care that they take in communicating around what they're doing. They always try to communicate what they're doing, right? That's why Jay Powell has a press conference after every FOMC meeting. But I think it puts an onus on the Fed to be extra clear in explaining why you're doing what you're doing. You're not making sudden sort of hyper-discretionary moves. I think that's what Rob Kaplan was talking about. You're explaining what you're doing. You're trying to make it look like you're following a plan. You're not deviating from sort of standard operating procedures. And so I would expect to see the Fed leadership try quite hard and again, they always do this to some extent, but you're going to be very, open about, well, here's what we're doing. If we're cutting rates when the economy's strong, here's why we're doing that. You sort of have to make the case here for whatever it is that you're doing. And then, the Fed is probably going to hope that something crazy doesn't happen in September and October that requires them to do something that is, unpredictable. But, September 2008, we did have unpredictable. And so when events arise, the Fed is going to respond to them. They're not going to say, well, it's an election year, so we're not going to do the thing that we would normally do. You can definitely overthink these things.
Nick, always love having you on the show. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.